Welcome to This Explainer. Today we're diving into a mind-bending scientific mystery straight from the cutting edge of cognitive neuroscience. Usually, we think of sight as a purely physical thing. Light bounces off a coffee mug, hits your retina, and boom, your brain says, coffee mug. But what if it doesn't always work that way? What if your brain could literally see complex patterns without your eyes doing anything at all? Imagine sound alone carving out a physical shape of light right in your mind. Crazy, right? Well, that's exactly the profound question we're unpacking today, looking at a phenomenon known as Basirah, or inner sight. So, where does an idea like this even come from? Well, this incredible journey actually starts with an ancient text. Dr. Ruhi El-Qadir, she's a lead researcher at MIT's Visual Perception and Cognitive Neuroscience Lab, was deep into studying things like blind sight and how our brains filter perception. But she found this completely unique flash of inspiration from a specific verse in Surah Al-Qiyamah. The Arabic text uses the word basira, which loosely translates to inner sight, or having this sort of profound internal witness or insight. And it got Dr. Ruhi thinking, could basira actually be a real neurological process? Like, could there be a hidden visual pathway in our brains completely independent of our eyeballs? As you can imagine, bringing this up in an MIT lab sparked an immediate clash. In one corner, you've got Dr. Ruhi proposing this bold, cognitive inner visual pathway. In the other corner, her colleague, Dr. Jonathan Stark. He is your classic, strictly materialist neurobiologist. For Jonathan, vision is just a math equation. An electrochemical signal travels from the retina, passes through the LGN, basically the brain's visual relay station, and dumps into the primary visual cortex. End of story. In its strictly hard science worldview, there's zero room for something as poetic as inner sight. And honestly, this fierce disagreement is exactly what sets the stage for a truly groundbreaking experiment. Okay, so how do you actually test something like inner sight? Dr. Ruhi's approach was brilliant. She brought in 30 volunteers, completely blindfolded them so there was absolutely zero light getting in, and slid them into an fMRI machine. Then she played 3 different audio tracks. First up, plain white noise. The result? Just random spontaneous static in the visual cortex. No big deal. Next, a Bengali poem. This triggered a little bit of activation, mostly emotional, but still no distinct pattern. But then, the third test. When she played a recitation of Surah Al-Qiyamah, the fMRI went wild. It recorded a massive 40% spike in the bold signal, that's the blood oxygen level dependent signal, in the visual cortex. And it wasn't random noise. It was a highly organized perceptual filter pattern. It was as if their brains were suddenly seeing the audio. Now, to figure out what the brain was actually seeing, Dr. Ruhi used multivoxel pattern analysis to decode the fMRI data, and what she found was just staggering. Down in the V4 region of the brain, which is the area specifically responsible for processing complex shapes and geometry, the neurons were firing in a highly specific coordinated sequence. They were physically forming a neural engram, essentially a memory trace, that perfectly matched the fractal geometry of the Arabic letters for the word basira. I mean, let that sink in for a second. These volunteers had their eyes totally shut, in the dark, yet their visual cortex was physically drawing out the shape of the word they were listening to. Naturally, Dr. Jonathan, our resident skeptic, wasn't buying it. He argued, look, it's just the acoustic frequency of the recitation bouncing around and triggering a default network. So he set up his own counter-experiment. He created a purely synthetic audio tone that perfectly mimicked the acoustic frequencies of the recitation, but he completely stripped away the human voice and, crucially, the meaning. He played it for the subjects, and, drumroll please, it was a total failure. The synthetic tone just created an unrecognizable, blurry mess in the primary visual cortex. Dr. Ruhi immediately pointed out why. Jonathan copied the sound perfectly, sure, but he completely removed what she called the meaning loop. So, why does the meaning matter so much? Well, it comes down to a fascinating neuroscience concept called predictive coding. Basically, our brains are prediction machines, constantly guessing what's going to happen next based on context. Dr. Ruhi realized that the temporal envelope, meaning the specific timing and the emotional narrative of the spoken words, is what actually excites the visual cortex. The brain actively uses the meaning of the recitation to predict and literally generate an expected visual representation. It needs that meaning to build the picture, even when you're sitting in complete darkness. And this entirely redefines how we understand the perceptual filter. Usually we think of this filter as something that just tidies up what our physical eyes see, but Dr. Ruhi's computer models revealed something wild. During this specific recitation, the brain sends out a top-down neural signal. This signal acts like a bridge. It grabs the auditory input, the meaningful sound of the words, and actively reorganizes it into physical visual geometry inside the brain. We are not talking about a metaphor here. It's a literal physical resonance state that translates a sound wave directly into an inner visual shape.
Okay, so how do you prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the eyes aren't involved? You raise the stakes. Dr. Ruhi brought in a very specific new cohort, exactly 10 participants. But these weren't just any participants. These were cortically blind patients. This means their actual eyes were perfectly fine, but their primary visual cortex, the V1 region, was completely and permanently damaged. They were physically incapable of processing visual light from the outside world.
The results from these 10 patients? Absolutely mind-blowing. Remember, their primary gateway for sight, the V1, is essentially a dead zone. But when they listened to the audio recitation, their fMRI scans lit up like a Christmas tree. Their higher-order visual areas, specifically the V5/MT and IT regions, which are the brain's heavy-duty shape and object recognition centers, fired up strongly. And again, it wasn't random static. They successfully formed that exact same Basirah fractal pattern. Their brains were literally bypassing the broken physical hardware of their visual cortex and seeing the pattern using higher cognitive pathways.
This was the ultimate turning point for Dr. Jonathan. The hardened skeptic decided he had to test it on himself. He walked into a pitch-black, light-proof room, put on noise-canceling headphones, and just listened. 10 minutes later, he walked out completely stunned. He said, and this is a direct quote from the source, "I am seeing something. It is not a color, not an object, it is a vibrating geometry, as if my brain is making light in the dark." Dr. Ruhi immediately threw him in the scanner, and sure enough, the fMRI confirmed it. His brain was locked into that exact physical resonance state. This inner sight wasn't just some hallucination. It was a measurable physical reality.
So how is this bypass physically happening? To figure that out, Dr. Ruhi mapped what she dubbed the alternate visual connectome. She used diffusion tensor imaging, which is this really cool technique that traces the actual physical wiring inside the brain. Normally, sight follows a strict path, retina to LGN to V1 to V4 to IT. But her graph theory mapping revealed a completely hidden highway. The imaging showed this pathway bypassing the usual stops and connecting the visual processing centers directly to a neural network strongly associated with the heart, referred to in the study's source text as KELB.
And what's wild is that this visual-acoustic coupling doesn't just create some flat 2D image in your head. The scans revealed a fully 3D neural choreography. It maps this inner sight and the heart network into one unified, incredibly organized system. Looking at his own DTI data, even Dr. Jonathan had to throw his hands up and admit that an illusion, by its very nature, is random. But this pattern? It was so systematically organized and perfectly structured that calling it a simple trick of the mind was mathematically impossible.
The climax of this whole scientific journey happened at the massive International Society for Neuroscience conference. Dr. Ruhi stood up in front of thousands of her peers and projected this exact comparison. On one side, the chaotic, messy fMRI map of a brain listening to white noise. On the other side, the shockingly clear, beautiful fractal geometry mapped out in a brain experiencing the Basirah pattern. She publicly presented this not as a glitch, but as a default perceptual state, a genuine alternate visual pathway that is activated entirely by the syntax of mean.
And right after that presentation, Dr. Jonathan stood up and delivered a profound public concession. After 30 years of building his career on the idea that vision is nothing more than photons hitting a retina, he admitted his entire paradigm had shifted. Sight is not just a passive reaction to light, it is the brain's active, predictive power. As he told the crowd, the brain can absolutely see with closed eyes as long as its perceptual filter is properly calibrated to the right semantic and temporal syntax. Just an incredible turnaround.
Now you might be wondering, okay, cool science, but what does this actually mean for us? Well, it matters deeply, because this isn't just lab theory anymore. It is actively being applied as visual perception therapy in Dr. Ruhi's lab as we speak. Cortically blind patients are going through a 6-month program where they simply listen to these highly specific acoustic patterns. And the results? Honestly, they're staggering. 40% of these patients are starting to experience literal light flickers in their minds. And the fMRI scans back it up, confirming the Basirah neural pattern is actively firing. Through the power of sound, they are literally teaching the human brain to generate its own inner light.
We'll wrap up this explainer by looking at the conclusion of Dr. Ruhi's upcoming book, appropriately titled Basirah, Inner Light. She beautifully summarizes all this research by noting that when we close our eyes, we expect to see darkness. But with the right acoustic and semantic triggers, an inner light can emerge, not from our eyes, but from the incredible predictive power of the brain itself. She leaves her readers with a final provocative thought that perfectly blurs the line between hard empirical neuroscience and deeply personal perception. She writes, "She saw this phenomenon clearly on the fMRI. The question is, can you see it in your heart?"